So I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about the three important theoretical perspectives in sociology. As I mentioned earlier, sociology is the study of human societies, or I think I said the scientific study of human societies. Part of that definition is about scientific studies, and the other part is about the ways that we think about human societies, and these are our theories. We look at human societies from the perspectives of three different sort of worldviews or ways of looking at the world that inform the ways that we're going to think about our societies as we're looking at them. This might not make sense until I just go ahead and do the lecture, I think. The first one that we look at is functionalism. Under functionalism, we believe that various social institutions and processes in society exist to serve some important or necessary function to keep society running. So another way to say this would be that if we were looking at society from the perspective of functionalism, what we would believe is our foundation about society is that every aspect of society, even the negative things, serve an important function for keeping society going and to maintain the social order. So obviously education serves an important function in society. Policing serves an important function in society. Religious institutions serve important functions in society. But functionalists would also claim that some of the things that we find more difficult also serve important functions, like crime and poverty. So functionalists look at the world from the presumption that social order is possible, that all of the different parts of society make up the whole and are interdependent on each other, and that members of society agree on what would be good for everybody, and everybody cooperates to achieve it. From the functionalist perspective, when we're trying to find out about different parts of society, we ask, what is the function of that aspect of society? So let's move on to conflict theory. Conflict theory views the structure of society as a source of inequality that always benefits some groups at the expense of other groups. So from the conflict perspective, people who are looking at the world, their worldview is based on the idea that society is always changing and is always marked by conflict. Conflict perspective is different from functionalist perspective regarding the way that the social order is looked at. So from the functionalist perspective, change is harmful and social order must be maintained really at all costs. But from the conflict perspective, the social order is looked at as something that is imposed on the weak by the powerful to maintain the status quo in society. So from the conflict perspective, change is good. From the perspective of conflict theory, we're always looking for inequalities in societies. So we look at who is benefiting from various social arrangements. And so we ask from the conflict theory, who is benefiting from this particular social arrangement? And that's how we would look at the world through the lens of conflict perspective. Now, social constructionism is a little bit different than both of these. From the social constructionist perspective, members of a society discover, make known, reaffirm, and alter a collective version of facts. what social constructionists focus on is how the different parts of society are defined and why are they defined in those particular ways. An example of that might be marijuana use. As you know, in California, marijuana use is now, you can purchase marijuana legally for recreational purposes. This was not the case last year, and it was definitely looked down upon 10 or 20 years ago. So, how did marijuana come to be defined as, how did marijuana use come to be defined as socially acceptable behavior, whereas in the past it was not considered socially acceptable behavior? So, social constructionists aren't really making a judgment or looking at the social order. What they're looking at is how different aspects of society come to be defined in a certain way and why. I'm going to give you another example here. So, from the social constructionist perspective, it is assumed that all all aspects or most aspects of social life don't have a natural or intrinsic meaning, but that meaning has come to be developed through social interaction. An example of that would be in the gesture that we see on the screen. What you can see is a man who is holding his hands up together under his chin, held close to his chin or his face. And when we look at this picture, even without the title on this slide, we would know that this gesture signifies prayer. Now think about it. What is prayer exactly? And where is it located in your body? Most people would argue that prayer is something that is in your mind. It's maybe meditation or maybe a conversation that you have in your mind. Some people might argue that prayer is located in your heart or in your soul. But not many people would argue that the prayer itself is located in the hands clasped in front of you. This gesture has come to be seen as prayer through a process of social interaction. We see other people doing that, and it signifies prayer, and so maybe we do it as well. I'm sure you can think of other gestures that signify prayer. I'm Jewish, and in the Jewish tradition, bowing and swaying are some ways that we indicate that we are praying. But the praying still takes place in the mind. So the gesture has been socially constructed. My favorite one is this one. This is kind of a gross looking picture of breakfast, sort of a weird yellow color. But we look at this, we immediately register this meal as breakfast, although I know some of you eat breakfast for dinner, right? So we've got the bacon, we've got the eggs, the potatoes, fruit, toast, sausage, all of that together to us spells breakfast. Okay, so why is that breakfast? You might ask yourself, if you think about it through using your sociological imaginations, how did this come to be defined as breakfast? You might say, well, it's got protein, it's got carbohydrates, it's a pretty balanced meal. Well, I mean, you could find that maybe also in a hamburger, right? Even a milkshake might be considered high in protein. It could be, it could be tofu scramble might be considered breakfast. In other parts of the world, they eat vastly different things for breakfast, like noodles or rice or fish. So we have come to define this particular food as breakfast through social interaction over time. Now, some of you eat breakfast for dinner, But I'm going to argue that you usually, I bet you say, I'm going to have breakfast for dinner instead of just having this meal at dinner time. And so this is an example, again, of social constructionism. I'm going to give you two more examples, and then we will be done. So these young ladies in this picture are tweens, and we know tweens as kids who are like 11 and 12, maybe 10, 11, and 12. It's the years between being a young child and a teenager. So I'm going to argue that the tween category, that, what we call tweens, is also socially constructed. As a matter of fact, when I was 10, 11, or 12, there was no category called tweens. And we were kids up until we were 12, and then we were teenagers after we were 13. This is just an arbitrary categorization that rests on the number of years that you have with you. And I'm going to also argue, and this is sort of the, well, I guess I haven't quite answered my lecture quiz question yet, that the other categories that I've mentioned, teenagerhood and childhood, are also socially constructed categories. Where they fall, what years they cover, is socially constructed. It's extremely arbitrary and doesn't have a particular meaning. You might say, well, teens are teenagers because it's like 13, 14, 15. Well, those are just words that are attached to years and don't have that much meaning. They could be called anything. They're just years. Even the years themselves are, to some degree, socially constructed. And then the last category, we will talk about this in week 6, I think, but this is President Obama, and you may know that President Obama is biracial. His mother was Caucasian American and his father was African, but we call him Black, or we call him African American. That we call him that, well, we'll talk about it later, why we call him African American, but that he is called that, although his ancestry doesn't just lie with, being African American, is also socially constructed. And as we will talk about in I believe it's week 6 or week 7, this is not the case in all cultures and in all countries. And so that's the way that we know something is socially constructed. So if you look on your lecture quizzes and you look at the very last question, the answer is all of the above, because all of the categories that we talked about, teenagerhood, childhood, tween, African American, they are all considered socially constructed. Okay, that does it for our lectures for this week. I'm looking forward to working with you all, and we'll see you on the discussion board and in next week's lecture.